All right, well, we can go ahead and get started and let people join throughout as they come in. Thank you all for being here. This is the second event in an ongoing People's Pitzer speaker series, all about civic activism and alternative forms of creating change through civic channels and popular movements. We're really excited to have Kamid Khan here with us today, who is the campaign coordinator for the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. We're hoping to have a very interesting talk. Hamid has done incredible work in combating police violence and oppression of minority communities within LA and moving that work into the larger community. We'll start off the day with a little bit of a structured presentation about the work of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, and then move into a structured Q&A period. And at the end, we'll have time for open questions and conversations and time to connect directly and have more of an open style conversation. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to raise your hand or jump in or put them in the chat. And we want this to be a space where everybody can communicate freely. And so without holding it up too much, I'll let Hamid take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invite. I'm just getting ready to hit my phone so it stops making these noises as I'm having this conversation. Happy to be here, honored to be here, and looking forward to the conversation. Again, my name is Hamid Khan. I go by he, him. I'm an organizer and the coordinator with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Just a little bit about myself. I have been organizing in Los Angeles for about 35 years. I was born and raised in Pakistan, so I'm an immigrant from Pakistan and came here in the late 1970s. From pretty early on, been involved in various social justice movements. I was involved in helping start the South Asian Network out of Artesia in East Los Angeles County, which was a coming together of communities from South Asian origin, immigrant communities from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal. Then also helped start the LA Taxi Workers Alliance, organizing with taxi workers in LA. That included about folks from about 50 different countries. And then since 2010, been involved with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which came about as a result of some of us who had been historically involved in Los Angeles in the anti-state violence movement and how fighting back around on police brutality and other forms of institutional racism, particularly the national security police state, which included groups like South Asian Network, the one that I was with, also Los Angeles Community Action Network, Youth Justice Coalition, and various other groups, looking at that how increasingly counterterrorism and counterinsurgency tactics and programs that were being used in the battlefronts of Iraq and Afghanistan were being rapidly incorporated into domestic policing, which was nothing new. We saw a major expansion of that post Vietnam. And of course, even going back in history as well, looking at that how the colonization and occupation of Philippines became a primary location to turn that into a laboratory around surveillance and social control, and even predating that as well, going back. So for us, when I say us, folks who came together, it was critical to start investigating and organizing against these developments that were taking place. And especially, just post 9/11, as we saw these laws coming down, but also along that with the rapid expansion of technology, that how technology and particularly this language around technology of artificial intelligence and machine learning and risk assessment tools and predictive algorithms and predictive analytics. And there's a whole dictionary that one can go through now, that how technology was being touted and pushed as this new frontier under the guise of that technology is race neutral and it will remedy some of the deeply embedded and inherent racism in policing and institutional racism, which was a lie. I mean, like, just like everything else, like when we look, whenever police opens their mouth, that half of that is already, just a misconstrued or misrepresented statements that they're making, and nothing surprising. So in a sense, so kind of that's what brought us together. But also, what brought us together was that we were not, I mean, we'd been on the forefront of fighting the national security police state, but we were not walking into it, looking at it through this, I would say, a more sanitized version, although it is really critical, it is important, but it sanitizes the impact when we speak about invasion of privacy. Because surveillance is typically seen through that lens as an invasion of privacy. But I think the question really is that who has access to that privacy, and particularly as we were grounding ourselves in our communities, and we based ourselves at Los Angeles Community Action Network, which is our home in downtown Los Angeles, located in Skid Row. And Skid Row, if people have ever been there, right under the shadow of extreme wealth and affluence, which LA CAN, Los Angeles Community Action Network, calls it the dirty divide, is a huge mass of our families, our communities, and other folks of humanity living in some of the most dire conditions, but also is a model of how resilient people are and what survival really means. So for us, it was really crucial that how do we desensationalize this whole rhetoric of national security and start looking at our organizing, and to challenge these notions of invasion of privacy, and to even speak about it, that who even has that privilege. Like, you have these bodies laid bare, just who are always, in these communities, become laboratories and testing grounds for policing and various other tactics. So shifting that focus, and I just want to step back again, because if we are stuck in invasion of privacy, and this is a conversation that Benjamin and I had when we were talking about this conversation, that when we look at through the lens of invasion of privacy, then we start looking at those remedies as well, which are also very limited. And those remedies are that, okay, well, what gives us or guarantees us supposedly that privacy? And that language is codified in supposedly the Constitution. But if the Constitution itself has been a blueprint for oppression, if the Constitution over the last 200 plus years has been there, which really, when you look at many communities, who even has access to the protections of those constitutions? Like, who can even afford protections of the Fourth Amendment or the First Amendment or this amendment or that amendment? So then it was very clear that more than invasion of privacy, these tactics and methodologies are there with the intent to cause harm, and with the intent to cause harm to the same communities, which I'm reminded by Professor Simone Brown's work, who wrote this seminal book called Dark Matters on surveillance during slavery, and who says that surveillance is nothing new to Black folks. It is the fact of anti-Blackness. So when we look at surveillance, it is not just a matter of just looking at it like post 9/11 or something tapping into our phones. It has been going on forever. So that's the groundwork, and then started investigating and examining these various programs, and looking at it, that how it is about our goal was to build power, to build that knowledge, to mainstream this and popularize this conversation around surveillance, and to demystify the whole conversation, but also with the goal, because it can also be very sort of overwhelming as well. Just constantly it surrounds you. But the goal was to build power and not paranoia. And the goal was to build power in a sense that how do we fight back, because these structures are flawed by design. And when people talk about broken immigration system or broken this, well, this is not. These are not broken systems. They are very well doing the job that they were designed to do. And they were designed in such a way that who and what bodies would need to be contained and controlled and criminalized, what bodies need to be traced and tracked and monitored, and how they become tools for social control. So I thought maybe I can go through a quick a slide presentation as well, where this is something that, oops, let me just see if I can get it right. Okay. Can folks see this? See the slides? Okay. So just wanted to kind of just share a few things with you, and I'll take another 10, 15 minutes because I would love to have a conversation as to where folks are and how are we organizing in different places. Because one of our major fights is also around academic complicity, that how the academy is deeply complicit in where we are, whether it was, I mean, even not going back too far back, whether it was the justification of a Black person being three-fifth human, or it was pushing, narratives and practices around eugenics, or it was around various other things. So it's really critical for us in our work that what is going on, what kind of organizing is going on, particularly within schools and campuses, on because that's where major fights are happening as well. Um, so here's something like talking about academic complicity. That this is a quote from Dr. Edward Banfield, who was a professor emeritus of social science and at the University of Chicago. This is back in the 50s or so. At Harvard and Penn State, and then became an advisor to Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan. And why it's really crucial is that this is about the time during Nixon in the late 60s where the war on gangs and the war on crime was being unleashed as well. So and this is a quote from his book called The Unheavenly Cities. And here's a passage from where he's speaking about, and one can figure out whom. And he says that the implication that lower class culture is pathological seems fully warranted. Rather than waste time and public money implementing policies based on the false notion that all men were created equal, better to just face facts and acknowledge the natural divisions that exist. Members of the lower classes should leave school in ninth grade to get a jump on a lifetime of manual labor. The minimum wage should be repealed to encourage employers to create more jobs for low value labor. The state should give intensive birth control guidance to the incompetent poor, and the police should feel free to crack on young men. So now, when you're talking about, like, who should the police be feel free to crack down, which communities should be given intensive birth control guidance to the incompetent poor, and why the minimum wage should be repealed to create more jobs. So, I mean, it is a very loaded statement. It is a very loaded statement in the sense of, if we were to start talking about, just how public policy is formed, how public policy is guided, how roadmaps of public policies are created, this is where the justification comes in. So no wonder he becomes the president advisor to these presidents. And then we know how these wars on gangs and drugs and crime were unleashed, and how gang databases and gang inductions, and who got into these things and who are being impacted. So this becomes really crucial for us. And again, for our work, it's really about looking at that, how surveillance, spying, and infiltration is there to for social control around, and it is embedded in race and poverty and suspect bodies. Now, whoever those suspect bodies are, and how the white gaze sees, through that white supremacist lens, sees the world, that how social control should be happening. But there were also these guiding values that we ground our work in. One being not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. So in a sense, and I'll go through a quick snapshot, that what we are talking about today didn't really happen yesterday or today. It's been going on forever. Surveillance has always been the tip of that policing knife, and that's why, as abolitionists, when we talk about policing, it is always that why people talk about abolition, and I know that it's gaining a whole lot of steam and it's becoming more mainstream conversation, that it comes from an understanding and lived experience and analysis, that at some point we have to make a decision and see that, no, this just doesn't work anymore. Why is the Los Angeles Police Department, that has been around for 152 years, still in their documents, and the first thing they say is that our goal is to build trust in the community? Well, if you haven't built trust in the community, if there's so many community members who look at you as violence workers, more than, to quote a term from Professor Jody Armour, that they're violence workers rather than public safety workers. So when you leave home with guns and canines and tasers, and those are the tools for work, well, then you're leaving work with a particular reason. So in a sense, that's where these things come in. So for us, it's not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. Also looking at it, that there's always a creation of the other. And went back to what the justifications are, how policies are made, and who we need to protect ourselves from. For example, like and how these faces over time have been paraded, both culturally and economically and politically and socially. The face of the savage native, the face of the criminal black, the face of the illegal Latino, the face of the manipulative Asian, the face of the terrorist Muslim, the face of the deviant trans or the fembody. So now these justifications on a cultural level are being created, where these narratives are developed, and then laws are created to protect ourselves from that. Those out there, the hordes of these dirty people at the border. Those terrorists are coming. The Russians are here. So there's always, which leads us to the third piece about desensationalizing this rhetoric, that no, it's not just like, that let's keep it grounded, because these things are always there 24/7. And our fight is really anchored in human rights, where we don't limit ourselves to constitutional or civil rights and civil liberties, but it's really about what does a claim to human rights mean? And it's not driven by something like a codified language of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because that also was written by if you think about it, by colonizing nations who even defined that what our human rights would be. But it's about the human rights for us becomes really crucial, that I claim my right as a human just by virtue of being a part of this natural universe. So, I don't need a legal codification that, but that my human rights are only limited up to this. When I speak about right to housing, right to a safe space, right to my body, right to that's why when we talk about, sexual assault and violence and homophobia and transphobia and all of that, that's what it's really fighting back, that, that I claim my right to celebrate myself as a human being, as a part of the natural universe. So that's where our human rights comes in. Here, just quickly wanted to give you a snapshot of the history of policing and surveillance. And I don't know how many folks have heard about lantern laws, and some of this is coming from Professor Simone Brown's scholarship as well. So lantern laws were laws in New York City back in the early 1700s, that if you were an enslaved body, like a black body or an indigenous body, and if you're out in public without being accompanied by the master, you would have to walk with a lantern to self-identify yourself as a threat, and the lantern with a candle wick to self-identify yourself as the other. So in a sense, it's almost like bringing the spotlight on yourself. And I think we can always talk about it within the system, that now when we talk about electronic monitoring and the PASS system, and of course I'm reminded about the apartheid Israeli state and what's now beginning to happen in Kashmir as well, that how these, like, the other is created, and to identify, and not only to subjugate and dehumanize and to make mockery, but also forcing people to identify themselves, that you can only, like, again, going back to Israel, that you can only drive on this piece of the road because you're not fit to be a human enough to drive on this side of the road, or not human enough to be a part of this. So that's how, kind of building on that eugenics and the apartheid system, and of course the black codes and the PASS laws and Jim Crow. Now, red squads are also something really important as well, because a lot of times when people talk about surveillance, people talk about the FBI, but FBI was preceded by local law enforcement and these federal agencies way before the FBI was present. So red squads came into being after, in the late 1800s, about 1886. There was a famous strike called the Haymarket Strike in Chicago, and this strike was for an 8-hour workday. So when we now take things for granted or natural, and of course, like the assault on labor continues with contingent labor and various other things, but this was a big fight, which led to the creation of May Day. So when we talk about May Day and the International Workers' Solidarity Day, its roots are in this strike in Chicago in 1886, which was violently put down by law enforcement agencies. People were later on, they were executed. But within 2 years, the Chicago Police Department created a covert intelligence gathering section within Chicago, and they were called the Red Squads. Like, you know, the communist scare, and everybody is turning into a communist because people are asking for an 8-hour workday. People are asking for dignity at labor. So, well, they may be communists, and they're going to overthrow this white Anglo-Saxon system, you know, because we're all going to turn to communists. So that turned into the International Workers' Solidarity Day. But the Red Squads were formed, and then they became these covert sections of intelligence gathering in all over the country, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, in Seattle, in New York. And then, of course, the war on drugs and the war on crimes and war on terror, Operation Hammer, on and on and on up to today with predictive policing and Operation Laser and various other forms of. So in a sense, this is not even, you know, just scratching the surface, as they say, but really kind of just highlight that, you know, when we are talking about it, it goes back a long way. This is just an architectural surveillance that we have identified and mapped out with the LAPD, and I'll talk about some of this, but suspicious activity reporting program, where my icon is, iWatch is a see something, say something program. These are basically a national security intelligence gathering programs. See something, say something is basically recruits community informants and, quite frankly, snitches in the community who become eyes and ears and become deputized. But what's interesting is that these counterterrorism and national security intelligence gathering you know, programs that were developed, you know, were really around. They have been incorporated, but when we forced the Los Angeles Police Department Inspector General to do an audit of these programs, what really came out was that we saw that predominantly there was a disparate impact on the Black community. So even under counterterrorism and national security laws, what we saw was the same communities being impacted. And yes, after San Bernardino shootings and all of that, you know, there was a spike where there were more Muslims and Middle Eastern folks who were, and South Asian folks who were, and Arab folks who were part of these secret lists as well. But that's why, but it was very much impacting the Black and other brown communities. These are just some of the technologies that the law enforcement uses. This is a digital receiver technology, and it can gather a whole bunch of information from our phones. It's used on drones, and it can also gather information if your phone is turned off. And even if it's an encrypted stuff as well. This is called a Stingray. You may have heard of this thing. This is also very commonly used. So what Stingray and Dirtbox, the DRT box, do is that they mimic cell phone towers. They're like a suitcase size rectangular box carried in an SUV, and wherever they go in the adjoining area for a few hundred feet, it throws out these electromagnetic rays where it mimics these cell towers. So all your phone conversation and phone information is rerouted through this box, and instead of your carrier, and it could be taken in by the police department. This is called trapwire technology, and if you see, there's a little black box at the bottom. So this works in conjunction with, and particularly at night, through infrared imaging and various type of thermal imaging, it picks up your body image as you're walking down the street and uploads into various databases. This is a high definition camera that is installed at the bottom of helicopters. This was used quite extensively during Occupy movement, and their claim is that they can pick up a candy wrapper from 5,000 feet because it's such a powerful camera and huge pixels, or whatever the technology is. This is a license plate reader, used quite a bit. And really kind of just able to hit about 1,000 license plates a minute. A drone, we had a huge fight against the LAPD. We're able to keep the drones grounded for about 3.5 years, but more recently, about a year and a half ago, it was approved. So they've been using these drones. Body cameras, we also came out against the body cameras as well, because from our vantage point, it's a tool for surveillance, a 24/7 tool for surveillance. This came directly from the battlefront of Afghanistan. This is like a submarine scope, and it's called Freedom on the Move, that it also does facial recognition. And this is an actual picture from when we were out on the streets on one of the May Day marches in downtown Los Angeles in 2016 or so, and this was being deployed to pick up information on people. But surveillance doesn't end there. And the last 4 or 5 slides I'll just share with you, I want to show you that how public sector agencies, private sector agencies, law enforcement are all a part of it. We've heard about Google and Facebook and Twitter and this, that, and the other. But this is through DMV, that how vast your information sharing is, that who has access to our personal information. This is about housing and urban development, that that how your information gets loaded up and is used by different agencies, Health and Human Services, which leads me to this. That this is something that we are working on, trying to unpack this thing, that how the stalker state works, that how information moves within various systems. So while this is a static Venn diagram, think of these things as constantly moving, overlapping, intersecting circles of various agencies that you're constantly, so again, trying to show that how our bodies are being datified and how the datification of our bodies is taking place, where we are kind of split up into a gazillion molecular beings, which are then being used for various purposes, whether it's by law enforcement, whether it's like all of a sudden people saying, hey, I was just thinking about these tennis shoes and they showed up on my screen. Well, what the heck is going on over here? So I think that's how we need to think about it, that in our fight, in our organizing, we're looking to understand that the scale, that whether you're walking down the street, whether in your car, whether you're on your phone, whether you're just out there with your family, just hanging out, or by the beach, or just going to DMV, or just like anywhere else, constantly the datification is happening, and it's not just limited to a local level, how information moves between local and regional sectors, regional to national, national to international. So it's this circular motion of information, and we call it the stalker state, because we are literally being stalked. So again, sharing all this information, not to create any paranoia, but to build power, because in order for us to fight back, we have to know our fight. The information, like here in the middle, is fusion centers. Fusion centers are these central hub and spoke systems of information gathering. So think of these as mega spy centers. There's about 80 plus, this is a much older picture, there are about 80 plus around the country, and one of the largest ones is in Norwalk in East Los Angeles County, off of the 5 freeway and 5 and Imperial Highway. And we had a couple actions over there. We basically put it in a lockdown as well. So that's what's been going on as well. So that's where our fight is. Let's see. Oops, sorry for that. I don't know why it just froze on me. Let me just, if I can come back to it and I'll wrap it up in a second. Okay. Oops. I'm so sorry. Let me just go back to this real quick again. I'm still very old school. So, and I will, okay. That was a fusion center, yeah. And this becomes really crucial as well. So this is how social network analysis is happening as well. So one of the things that that happens, particularly with law enforcement, and how they're targeting young people, that how our information. So look at just the red spots of the targets, and then how it sort of moves. And when we talk about the stalker state, that how one person, and this was the whole idea behind metadata. That how one person becomes a conduit for them to really identify and track their networks and theirs as well. So if you're talking to a friend, then maybe they can identify 10 friends. Each one of those friends has 10 more friends. Each one of those friends has additional 10 friends. So one person, some estimates are that one person can lead to close to about 100,000 people in these social network analysis, and how this information gets zapped up, and how we're constantly being targeted. And it's not just only for law enforcement agencies. I mean, your extended networks, people are like, just what your movie tastes are, what your socializing is, what your friends do, what kind of foods you like, what kind of clothing we like. So there's a lot about profit making. So I think when we talk about these ideologies, white supremacy, we also have to look at capitalism, we have to look at patriarchy, we have to look at settler colonialism. And I think increasingly we have to look at scientific objectivity, that how scientific objectivity is getting that sacredness and is becoming more and more powerful, where in a sense, the message that is being given to us is that, just drop it and just surrender, because, it's everywhere. And these are just some of these are all uploaded on our website. These are just some of the community-based reports that we have released from Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. This is on body cameras. This was on drones. This is about before the bullet hits the body was on predictive policing. This is more a recent one. We're also getting ready to release a report on land and policing around data-driven policing very soon. These are our demands, basically as abolitionists, absolutely looking to abolish these technologies. We're not there to reform them. And just in full disclosure, we actually have a campaign against the ACLU. So just, people look at it through a surprise, because we're not here to be scribes for the empire. We're not here to be scribes for the oppressors. We're not here to write down a policy proposal. We're not here to provide them the language. We're not here to reform this stuff, because it's extremely violent, it's racist, and it'll remain there. Our goal is to abolish and dismantle it. Now, when it happens, it's a multi-generational fight. So it's such a pleasure and an honor to have a conversation with you all. So I want to stop there, but I'm also want to honor the work, because some of the stuff that I had followed was that that how folks, at least on Pitzer College, are not only fighting the local fight, but it was because how globally these systems are moving as well, and especially the role of the state of Israel and UK and various other states. So I know that there was a big fight on campus around, and I made a note of it, to suspend the Pitzer Haifa campaign, and it was very heartening to see that so many faculty and students were a part of this thing. But it was really unfortunate that it got vetoed. But I think the fight continues. The fight never stops, and I think hopefully I would very much encourage for this fight to continue on. And we got to take it on a global level, because thinking globally and acting locally. The old saying. But what is happening in Haifa, what is happening in Gaza, is to an extent happening in South Central Los Angeles as well. To the extent that I don't know if you all know that, that's what they say, from Ferguson to Palestine. What does it really mean? How are communities being impacted? So I think it's really crucial, because why I say that is that in the early 2000s, after the Iraq invasion, there were 70 Marine Corps individuals assigned to the LAPD, which rolled with the LAPD through the streets of Los Angeles and learning counterinsurgency tactics from the LAPD that the Marine Corps then unleashed on the streets of Anbar province and in the occupation of Iraq as well. So all of these things, and the LAPD had trained El Salvadorian paramilitary squads. This is all documented. The LAPD was in the mix when in Rio, and the Israelis and IDF were there when the favelas were being destroyed because of the World Cup soccer and the Olympics. And now we have 2028 Olympics, the 2028 Olympics coming up. And we'll see exactly what happened, going back to the history of 1984 Olympics, as to what the cleaning was done, that our 43,000 youth, 43,000 young Black and brown youth were put into the system as a result of all of that stuff, and which led to the creation of gang injunctions and gang databases. So that's where our fight is. I would love for you all to join the fight and be a part of this thing, and however we can support, we're always there. So I'll stop right there. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for what was an incredibly interesting and informative presentation on the background of the work that you do. May I ask just if you could speak a little bit to what the coalition is involved in now in terms of action items, and you mentioned a new report that's being put together.
Yeah, so several things. We have some major fights going on, but which include both, obviously the narrative that we have developed about the intent to cause harm. It's also crucial that how do we look at surveillance through a very nuanced lens as well. And while race has been one of our primary lens that we have used, but we're also increasingly, now there's a whole working group every first Tuesday of the month. We have a whole webinar looking at surveillance and national security police state, how it intersects with gender and sexuality. that how how surveillance is being used, that the murders of Black trans women that have been going on, the impact on trans bodies, the impact on sex workers, that how predictive policing and hotspot policing impacts different communities, how femme bodies are being impacted, how patriarchy and the surveillance lens. Because when we think about it, social control is central to surveillance. Intelligence gathering is central. So when we look at through, as through patriarchy, I think it is critical that how keeping an eye on monitoring the other, monitoring the femme body became really crucial and set the template for patriarchy to flourish and to strengthen and to sustain itself. So that is one piece. And then what does it really mean? So we invite you to join that fight as well. The second Tuesday of the week, and the second fight is around the war on youth, that how young people are being now branded as a threat to national security, how these programs with this language around radicalization, language around extremism, programs around countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism, and various other programs are being used, which ultimately are being, the original lens was being like going after the Muslim youth, but now slowly how that is being expanded to the extent that in 2016, the FBI launched a whole program called Preventing Violent Extremism to monitor the behavior of K through 12 kids, like, and then going into college campuses and universities. Like, if somebody is too much into their culture, somebody is expressing anger, well, heck, I mean, as if young people have never done that. I was once upon a time an angry youth myself as well, and the expressions of anger or frustration or things like they took on different shapes, whether it was through spoken word or through whatever, or anything else. So how young people are being targeted, and the policing of young people are taking on a national security significance. So there's a whole fight around that as well, around data-driven policing, that how this language of pseudoscience or the veneer of science is being used around algorithms and risk assessment tools and this, that, and the other. And then also, so these are actively organizing fights as well. And of course, because of COVID, because we're still old school organizers, I mean, we still go door knocking. And talk to folks in different communities. And then, just another fight is around academic complicity, that we're going after folks who, especially in the academy, who are complicit and who are partnering, I mean, with the law enforcement and various other agencies developing, because predictive policing, for example, the algorithms was developed by the chair of the Department of Anthropology at UCLA, in partnership with the professor of mathematics. So Jeff Brantingham, Andrea Bertozzi, and various of these things. So we file for public records, we dig up their emails, and then we expose them publicly. So so there's a whole public expose, and that needs to happen. People need to be taken to task, and that's going on. And also going after nonprofits. Like we have launched a campaign against the ACLU's community control over police surveillance campaign, where they are trying to create these ordinances and providing a roadmap to law enforcement to create these public policies, which under the guise of that are using the language of transparency and accountability, but yet at the same time, what it's doing is it's legitimizing surveillance. It's providing more resources, it's providing more bureaucracy and all of that. So these are different, and we do it in partnership with different groups. We're very close partners with Black Lives Matter, with Los Angeles Community Action Network, with the Youth Justice Coalition, folks from National Lawyers Guild. We also use legal tools. We currently are in the middle of a public records lawsuit. We've launched, in partnership with Free Radicals, we've launched a campaign called Defund Surveillance, going after the budgeting piece, going after the LAPD and looking at these different technologies. We also have this one fight, a campaign around practice and sessions around embodying abolition. This is something that we launched with Color Coded about 3 or 4 years ago, that, we talk about abolition, but how do we embody it? What does that practice mean? How do we come together? How do we, I mean, I was born and raised in Pakistan. I come from a family of people who are in the military and they're cops as well. But how do we speak about it to our family members? How do we speak about racism? How do we speak about institutional racism? How do we speak about, like, what is when people say, well, all lives matter? Okay, but why are people saying, do we understand why people are saying Black Lives Matter? Like, have they ever mattered? Let's look at the history. So I think, in a sense, honoring those histories and honoring those people becomes really critical as well. So there's a whole lot, but yeah. And I'm a talker. As an organizer, I can talk all day long. So you're going to have to check me on that.
I'm sure we could listen to you all day long as well. As far as going back to what you were talking about with this academic complacency, do you have advice for what we can do as members of an academic space, as both scholars and activists, to combat that within Pitzer and the rest of the consortium, as well as any other spheres that we might interact with this work?
I mean, I think the actions and going back to, just really kind of just speaking out and organizing against the Zionist apartheid, and I think just kind of just really taking the campus to task and organizing and even having that vote to suspend and to pull out, because those are very critical things. Those trainings, because so here's the issue over here, and I feel honored to be in this space and having this conversation, because those are the spaces, just like over here, every 7 hours and 48 minutes somebody's murdered by law enforcement agencies. These are actual numbers. This is not something that I'm making up. Like last year, over 1,100 people were murdered by cops in the United States. And when you break it down, divided by 365 days and further divide by 24 hours, it comes to almost 8 hours somebody's being killed. So similarly, when you look at open air prisons that the apartheid state has created, and how drones are being tested, so they become laboratories and testing grounds for those things that are going to come back to us. So why has there been over 23,000 or 25,000 law enforcement individuals that have gone actually for training, hands-on training to Israel, to come back and do what? I mean, and that's where the laboratories are being experimented. That's what happened in Ferguson. So I think as a way, both in solidarity, but also locally here as well, that who on campus is providing these papers? What kind of papers are being written? What sort of just roadmaps are being what narratives are being driven? What conversations are happening? So I think there's a lot one can do, and in support to other communities as well, but for support from here to various other fights that have been going on all around the world. So I think there's a lot that one can do, and keeping an eye out and staying vigilant, just as to keeping their feet to the fire, but also organize against these things as well, because they will all come back to harm us.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. When last we spoke, you were mentioning an aspect of this fight that isn't often talked about, and that's the datification of bodies and this sort of pseudoscientific language that's often used by police to justify their surveillance. And I know you touched on this briefly in your presentation, but I was wondering if you could speak more to how that affects your work and how that affects the experience of these monitored communities that you're working within.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously it is, and as somebody was we had Yarden Katz on one of our webinars, who just wrote this book called Artificial Whiteness, which is about artificial intelligence, and how artificial intelligence is very much driven and rooted in the Department of Defense. That ultimately these are in service for the expansion of the empire. I mean, just to be very direct about it. Now, what that empire means, and imperialism, what does it mean? That it's not just about occupying, and obviously through economic strangulation and military occupation, it's all over the world, but it's also strangulation and economic occupation and colonization internally, domestically as well. So then how this pseudoscience and this veneer of science is being used for social control, how manipulation is happening, how these are and these we need to look at it. That what does psychops mean? Psychops is a military term which means psychological operations. So what does psychological warfare really means? And I think, I mean, we think of it that we have the freedom and liberty, and that's what really is being used. That hey, you have the freedom to go shop, you have the freedom to go eat whatever you want to. You have the yes on the face of it, but how am I being directed in a particular direction? How my thinking is being routed, because each one of those has a penny of a profit attached to it. And when you keep on multiplying it, it turns into a gazillion dollars. I mean, and even after being organizing, I was honestly very surprised to see that just in 2020, in 1 year, Elon Musk, who owns what is that one big corporation I'm forgetting right now, his wealth went from $27 billion to $185 billion. Now, when you 1,000 million make a billion. It is not even humanly possible to compute that how can one person increase their wealth in 1 year, right? So that's a datification of our bodies as well, because all of this profit making, this money is happening in this ether zone. So why is it happening? Because who's on the receiving end of that? Why is Jeff Bezos one of the most richest men in the world? Why is now, when it used to be that manufacturing companies, steel companies would be the largest sort of conglomerates, were the rulers of the empire. And now when you think about it, it's Apple, Facebook, Amazon. I mean, these are the major players around the world. It's not Chevron, and it's not really, I mean, while those are there, but this is where continues. So that's, and it is only happening because what they have done is that it's not only 8 billion population that they're dealing with. Each person within that 8 billion is now been spliced into a gazillion different data points, and each one of those data points becomes a profit node, right? So so we have to think about it more critically, that what is our fight and how do we examine these things critically, and then how does it trickle down every day to control us? And that's where law enforcement comes in. So the datification of our bodies, where data-driven policing comes in, that, okay, so we are going to predict, we're going to use these algorithms, and we're going to turn this thing into, because of the data that we have. But when you break it down, there's a lot of players in that ecology that are involved as well. The real estate developers are very much involved. The Department of Defense is very much involved. So in a sense, not the physical splicing of our bodies, but yet at the same time that our splicing up of our bodies into various data pickup points into the ether zone is something that we've been talking about, and that's where our fight is. Hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you. I want to take the time now and open this up to be an open Q&A period and conversation for people to jump in with any questions or thoughts they may have. You're also welcome to put things into the chat, but want to have a time to open up and speak directly as well.
Please.
Thank you so much, by the way, for coming to speak. I actually went to another one of your events through like Rupture I-Beam, I think, and Dylan Song was basically talking about the like SC archive and like the Before the Bullets
Hits the Body
campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and predictive policing. So
Mm-hmm.
it's, and I know you also talked a little bit about how like we can move efforts towards like collective accountability transnationally, and like abolition of like apartheid state. But do you also see any like radical alternatives for tech and data to be providing liberation?
I mean, these obviously, when we talk about technology and the tools for technology, I mean, I don't get into too much about exploring technology because it's being used for so many different reasons, whether it's about baseball games or horse racing or algorithms or various other things. I mean, I think there's always an opportunity that how do we flip the script on that? How do we use that to fight back? I think the question really becomes that what happens next, and whether we knowingly or unknowingly start submitting to the very forces that we are trying to fight back as well. So yeah, there's absolutely. I mean, like just people have used that. Revolutions have happened. Governments have been overthrown. But I think more than that, to me, it really comes down to the organizing. It really comes down to people power. I mean, what we are seeing right now in Myanmar, what we have seen over here as well. I mean, look at the uprisings that have been going on. I mean, there were millions of people all around, and what did it do? So it didn't require them people, and of course, people connected through social media. Of course, people connected through email. People connected through Twitter and messaging and all of that. But then these things had been going on, fights for liberation, before there was Twitter, before there was emails, before there were text messages as well. So I think it really comes down to as to in service to what, and what exactly are we trying to achieve. Then whatever tools are necessary, then we have to use them. And if these are the tools for today, then just meet you all around there, meet you outside the LAPD headquarters, even if they are tracking us, let them know. So definitely, I mean, just I think there are ways to, but it really comes down to that. What are the ways we want to use that? So that becomes really important, and to what end. Going back to the archiving piece that you were talking about, that's about we've started this whole archiving project, and it's a people's archiving project. And what's and actually we're having a conversation later on today with our team as well, is that we are also developing is what is known as, and I became acquainted with that in these conversations as well, is known as folksonomies. So like folks telling the story. So for example, in our archive, we're developing a website for that. So people can go to the search bar and look at all these documents through public records that we have gotten and do their research or whatever they want to do. But we also want to challenge the state's language as well. So what we are developing concurrently is a group of folks coming together and using street language and developing street language, which could be used for a search bar as well. So if people want to look for a police station, they don't have to, if they want to put Popo station or a pig station, they'll put it in a search bar and it'll show up. So it's a process of how do we then, in a sense, what does popular education really mean? How do we develop these conversation and language, which is rooted in the street, that how we speak to each other, and of course, kind of just keeping the other one too, a more formal side of it too. But we're super excited about this archiving project as well. Any other comments or questions or thoughts?
I can step back in if there's nothing else and just ask, because this fight is so far from over and because there is a necessity for this to continue to the next generation, and for people in our generation to pick up the pieces and to continue, how would you like to see the next generation of activists continue this work, change the work that's being done? What are the next steps, do you see?
I think I don't go very much into projections and how people should do that, because I think everybody has the power in their own space, in their own location, and in their own being. So I want to honor that. But I think, as we say that, riding on the shoulders of our ancestors and people who've been doing that, I think, and as we are becoming ancestors as well, I think it's a process of, number one, that how are we speaking to each other, and how are we speaking with each other, and how are we speaking collectively, and how we are sharing that knowledge, that things that I learned 35, 40 years ago, or maybe 50 years ago, and that what has that meant through my life in processing that knowledge and that information as well. Obviously, what does it mean today? How we used to speak about it, and that's where the folksonomies piece comes in as well. And how are people looking at state violence back then, and how are people looking at state violence right now? How are people looking as human rights back then, and how are people looking at it? And when you think about it, it's not a whole lot of difference, and because the fundamentals basically remain the same. The tools do change, but what we do with that really becomes critical. And I think for us, if we were to get really kind of in that mode of what we are leaving behind, I think one of the things that the coalition has done is really to change this narrative, not just locally but nationally and internationally as well, around how we look at surveillance. That no, it's not just that limited notion of the invasion of privacy. It's about the intent to cause harm. it's a very methodical way, and it's a tactical way, which is always there. It's not just only when somebody's listening to your phone or somebody's tapping into social media. It is always present. And to what end? So I think these are just some of the things that approaching it through that lens and walking into that. I mean, the old saying that we make the road by walking. It's how we kind of collectively come together and do this knowledge exchange. So I think you all are already doing stuff like the actions that I talked about Israel and suspending those exchanges and the deadly exchange that continues to happen. But hopefully, like I mean, in your own capacity, in your own space, in your location, in your own resources, I think hopefully the journey will continue, but hopefully the journey will be towards that, that we need to abolish these systems, we need to dismantle these systems, and then we have to come together to see, like, what, and in that process, what healing looks like, and what is our full claim to humanity really looks like.
Thank you. Yeah. Sophia, did I see that you had your hand up?
Oh yeah. I just had a question. Thank you so much for this discussion. This is amazing. I know that Esma and I think Adrian, I believe, were coming from a Palestine and Israel class taught by Professor Siegel, who was here, and just talking about the surveillance state and specifically the suppression of and deification of movement, like striking parallels to what's happening in occupied Palestine. I was wondering, I thought it was interesting when you're talking about in terms of the suit, the lawsuit on the ACLU and other nonprofit organizations that are more working within the system and talking about reform and writing that script, that bureaucratic script, and you guys are more focused on, or not more focused, like dedicated to abolition. What other organizations have been allies in terms of being abolitionists as opposed to reformists?
Right. Just to be clear, so the lawsuit is not against the ACLU or nonprofits. It's against the LAPD for the public records and information that we are gathering from them. But the campaign is to really kind of just challenge and to demand that the ACLU drop this campaign about community control over police surveillance. So to your point, Sophia, there's definitely a lot of organizations. I mean, I can name Los Angeles Community Action Network, and even to the extent that BLM has been working towards abolition as well. But I think it's also sometimes we get so, and for full disclosure, the coalition is not a nonprofit. We never filed for a 501c3. That was a collective decision that was taken, and it's very much supported by the community. I mean, in a sense, and I always like to talk about this as well, as like our big campaign, our fight against predictive policing at the LAPD that we ended up dismantling was led by a full-time registered nurse. Who was a nurse in Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles, but was committed because of their own experiences and families' experiences around police violence and all of that. So it's really a lot of folks from the community have joined us as well, who don't really just identify themselves as a formal group or an organization. So it's a mixed bag of folks, both organizationally from the nonprofit sector, but also folks who are not with organizations, but just on their individual accord have joined in and become a part of the various fights and campaigns too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've just hit our 1 hour mark, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, as well as yours. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. It was lovely to get here in an incredibly informative presentation. Where can people find you and get involved with the work of the LAPD Spy?
Yeah, so they can always go to our website. It's www. I'm going to type it in right there in the chat. www.stoplapdspying.org, and they can always. I'm going to also post our email address. It's straightforward Gmail address, so we don't use any PGPs or keys and all of that stuff, because we also have to be mindful about our communities. that who has access to full technology and all of that. So here's the information. Folks can always go to the website and yeah, always there. But we've been we meet every Tuesday at 6 o'clock. We used to meet in person for many years, but because of COVID, we've been doing it by webinar. This next Tuesday upcoming webinar is going to be on the war on youth. So the information is going to be uploaded on the website by Saturday or Sunday. So yeah, people can get that information and join the fight.